A recent study turned up some interesting results about what Canadian Christians actually believe. The study investigates if these beliefs are consistent with what an individual's Christian denomination belief is and if they match what the Bible teaches. So joining me from Ottawa is Reverend Dr. Andrew Bennett. He is the Faith Communities Program Director at Cardis, a Christian think tank, and the author of the study, Still Christian? What Canadian Christians Actually Believe. Welcome back to Bridge City News, Dr. Bennett. Great to have you on again.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with you.
Absolutely. Okay, so maybe tell us how you did the research for this study. You partnered with the Angus Reid Institute, right?
That's right. So we've had a long-standing partnership with the Angus Reid Institute going back about 7 years. They're our survey partners. So we developed the questionnaire in counterpart with them. And so the questionnaire really asks, first of all, we get people to tick the box. What are you? Are you a Catholic? Are you an Anglican? Are you an evangelical? And if you're an evangelical, what type of evangelical Christian? Then we ask people a series of 7 questions through which we can sort of establish, okay, how religiously committed are you? How evangelical are you? How Catholic are you? And those questions are more than simply, do you go to church? We ask people whether they believe in God or a higher power. We ask them, do you read the Bible regularly? Do you have an experience of God in your life? Do you want your children educated according to your faith tradition? And then that gives us a sense of how committed they are. Then what we did in this study is we posed 20 statements, some of which touched on doctrinal matters, so what churches teach, and some looking at moral questions. And we asked people to either agree or disagree with those statements, and they could agree or disagree strongly or somewhat. And so we had a sample size of just over 2,000 Canadians, of which just over 50% were Christians. And then that broke down into the 3 main groups that we looked at were Catholics, mainline Protestants, and then evangelicals. And that's as defined by Statistics Canada.
Okay. Now, in your research, you said 81% of evangelicals believe the resurrection of Jesus as a historical event, but only 48% of Catholics and 55% of mainline Protestants hold that belief. So that's a big disconnect, isn't it?
It's a major problem. The question I think we have to look at first is, how is a person an evangelical Christian? How is someone a Catholic? How is someone a member of a mainline Protestant denomination? With evangelical Christianity, it's a fairly cut and dry understanding. You're either in or you're not. So you're either fully in, you're committed to your particular evangelical denomination, or you're not. Former evangelical Christians typically don't call themselves evangelicals still, whereas there are a lot of Anglicans, Presbyterians, and certainly Catholics who are baptized in that church or those denominations, but they've lapsed, so to speak. They don't go regularly to church. They're probably not reading the Bible often. But they're still kind of in the family, right? So we had the Archbishop Emeritus of Toronto, Cardinal Thomas Collins, speak to us at the launch event for the report. And he said, if someone asks the Archbishop of Toronto, how many Catholics are there in Toronto? He'll reply, 2 million. But how many of those go to church on a regular basis? Maybe 300,000. So there's a different way in being evangelical as opposed to how Catholics are and mainline Protestants are. Now, that being said, the fact that barely half of Catholics and mainline Protestants believe that the central truth of the Christian faith, that Jesus Christ rose from the dead on the 3rd day for our salvation, that only half of them believe that that's an actual historical fact, is quite shocking. It points to a significant deficiency, I would say, in not only them being catechized, being instructed in their faith, but also just basic evangelization, asking the question that's so essential, who is Jesus Christ? And so I think we need to, maybe in a future study, dig into that a little bit deeper. Why is there this profound incoherence between someone who ticks the box and says, I'm a Catholic, but then half of them will say, well, I don't actually believe that the resurrection is a historical fact. Why is that? This survey doesn't really point to that specifically, but we can certainly come up with some hypotheses that we'd like to explore later.
Yeah, I mean, I find this research of yours interesting. You called it shocking before we hit record there. But another finding was that 65% of evangelicals disagreed that Christian moral teachings should evolve with changes in society's attitudes, whereas 72% of Catholics and 61% of mainline Protestants agreed. So, in other words, a majority of Catholics and mainline Protestants believe God's moral values are subject to changes imposed by modern society.
Yeah, again, this is a major challenge, and I think it reflects the nature of let's say, the ocean that all of us are swimming in. Evangelical Christians, in part because of this distinction I mentioned earlier, where if you're an evangelical Christian, you're either in or you're out, you're going to see higher numbers of evangelicals disagreeing with this statement. But for those Catholics and mainline Protestants who, again, tick the box, that's what I am, how faithful I am, well, that's another matter. But these, like all of us, we're swimming in a sea of secularism. And the main sort of secular ideas that we inhabit and that we live with in Canada, even as Christians, are that truth is not objective, truth is relative. That you can have your truth, I can have my truth. Well, of course, from a Christian perspective, that's nonsensical. We believe that truth is not a set of ideas that fluctuates with the age or that changes with the wind, but rather truth is a person. Truth is Jesus Christ. But when we kind of divorce ourselves from that objective reality of what is truth, Pontius Pilate's eternal question, what is truth? When we divorce ourselves from that and we see truth as something that is subjective, all about me and not objective, existing despite what my opinions might be, we can get into this situation where we think, oh, well, I mean, if society thinks that something is true or something that is good, or the law, for example, says that euthanasia is okay, or same-sex marriage is okay, or some of the real hot-button issues of our day, if the law says that that's true, well, then it must be true. And so people accept that without looking at it, through the lens of Christian tradition or through the lens of an anthropology, how we understand the human person that is informed by Christ. And so I think, again, Catholics and Protestants, mainline Protestants, have been more willing, unfortunately, to embrace that subjectivism, that individual autonomy that exists in the secular world. Again, by I think not being as well formed as they could be in their own Christian tradition.
Okay, well, one of the part of the study that I found most surprising was a finding that younger Canadian Christians display a stronger commitment to the teachings and practices of their faith compared to older generations. So, can you maybe unpack that for us a little bit?
Certainly, what we found consistently across various of the doctrinal questions and some of the moral questions is that in the 18 to 34 age cohort, um, there is both, and we know this from past studies we did with the Angus Reid Institute, there's a greater percentage of people in that age group who are not religious. They're not religiously engaged at all, much higher than the general population. But there's also a larger number of them, often to a degree of up to 5 or 6%, if memory serves me, who are more religiously committed than their parents' generation or their grandparents' generation. So why is this? I think because now there is no social pressure to be in church. There's no cultural reality that says, well, to be a good person, to be a faithful person, you need to be a Christian, or whatever the argument might be. That's no longer present. The world is telling most people, well, you don't need to be a Christian to be a good person. You don't have to believe in an objective truth to live a full and rich human life. But what we're seeing is that more and more young people are challenging that view of the world, that sort of secular, individualistic, materialistic view of the world, and saying, well, that hasn't done me much good. And I'm looking for something that is true. I want something that is not about me, but about something transcendent that goes beyond me, that I can enter into and live authentically and with integrity. And so I think we're seeing maybe the dawn of a new religious age, especially amongst younger Canadians. And those of us that are active in pastoral ministry, working in churches as pastors, as ministers, as priests, as deacons across the country, I think many of us would tell you that we're seeing this play out in the pews, that younger Canadians who have felt sort of adrift in this sea of secularism are coming back to the church often as totally blank slates. They don't really know much about Christianity, but when they discover a Christian faith that is lived authentically and with great integrity, they gravitate towards it like moths to a flame, and they want to live it out fully. And so I think this survey again reveals that they want to live something that is true, not something that is relativistic.
Were there any other findings that surprised you with this?
I was a little bit surprised. We asked a question about whether the government or the church is the primary sort of keeper of people, as the primary purveyor of social services. Should the government be doing that, or does the church have a particular responsibility to care for the poor, to help the elderly, to visit those in prison, everything that's mentioned in the gospel? And again, there's a significant cleavage between evangelical Christians and then mainline Protestants and Catholics on the other side. But even still, there was certainly a significant number of evangelicals who bought into this idea that no, government has the primary responsibility for social justice, if we want to use that language, or has the particular responsibility for charitable works. Well, government can have some role, and it's important that government have that role, but the church also has a role. And the church and government need to work together, as they have for many, many decades, to fulfill the needs of society. But it can't just be government, because government often is not able to get to the most local level where people need the greatest care. It's the churches and other religious communities that are running the 12-step programs in the church basement, or the refugee resettlement programs, or providing care for new mothers, or helping people with English as a second language, or the Boy Scouts or the Girl Guides. I think most Canadians know that in their local community, there are various churches and perhaps synagogues and gurdwaras that are fulfilling those roles. I wrote an article some years ago that was entitled, "Will the State Hug Me When I Die?" No, because the state can't do that. That's not the role of the state. That's the role of the Christian community and of the people that we are closest to. And so we have to, I think, have a much more nuanced understanding of the interplay between church and state. It can't just be the state, nor can it simply be just the church. But given the nature of our pluralist society, the two need to work in concert with one another. But as Christians, we know that as members of the body of Christ, as members of the church, we have a particular responsibility, as our Savior calls us, to care for the poor, the sick, the marginalized, those in prison, and so forth.
Was there much of a difference between how the three different groups responded to that one? Did you notice a variation, or was it just kind of the same?
Again, there was that similar cleavage between evangelical Christians who were largely a little bit concerned about placing the state first, but mainline Protestants and Catholics really have sort of accepted what we might call a statist idea, that the state is ultimately responsible for caring for those in need. And I think that's troubling. I think it's a misunderstanding of how there needs to be that dialogue between church and state. There needs to be coordination and cooperation between church and state. And this has major impacts on current policy debates in this country. So, for example, should faith communities, should charitable institutions that are faith-based have charitable status? Should they be able to issue tax receipts? Is the advancement of religion, which has been a core form of charity, of charitable activity for centuries, should that still be enshrined in law? And I think as Christians, we recognize what Christians do in the world and other faith communities do. And so I think we need to, again, ensure that we have a right understanding of that relationship between church and state.
So really quickly, what are the takeaways from this study? What can we learn from this?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that we should not, although it's shocking, some of these findings, I don't think we should go running around as Christians and as Christian leaders with a sort of the sky is falling attitude, or the end is nigh. I don't think that's helpful. Rather, I think we need to see this as an opportunity to rethink, what are we doing? How do we evangelize people? How do we catechize or instruct people in the faith, from preschoolers all the way up to adults? And how do we support people in living a public faith when they are challenged by what the world offers? How do they offer an effective Christian response to that? And I think that this study should be a clarion call, should be a wake up call to us as Christian leaders and as faithful Christians, that we need to pull up our socks and think of new ways to live out our Christian life and to instruct people, inform people in the faith, and therefore proclaim the gospel in the world.
All right, looks like we're out of time here, but thanks so much for joining us today, Dr. Bennett. Great to have you on.
Thank you.